You know, sometimes when I'm scrolling through my social media feed, I'll see a headline that just stops me in my tracks. Yesterday was one of those days. I saw the news about Mama Dodie Osteen passing away at 91, and it got me thinking about something we don't talk about enough in Christian circles. What happens when the matriarch of one of America's most famous megachurches dies? What kind of legacy does someone like that leave behind? I've been following the Osteen family story for years, and I have to tell you, Dodie's life reads like something straight out of the Old Testament. Here's a woman who literally helped build one of the largest churches in America from the ground up, starting in a feed barn with about 100 people who had basically been kicked out of their previous church. But that's not even the most remarkable part of her story. Let me take you back to 1981. Dodie Osteen was in her early 40s, wife of Pastor Joel Osteen, mother of 5 kids, and actively involved in running Lakewood Church. Then the unthinkable happened. She was diagnosed with metastatic liver cancer. Now, if you know anything about cancer, you know that when it spreads to your liver, especially back in 1981, that's essentially a death sentence. The doctors were brutally honest with her. They told her she had weeks, maybe a month if she was lucky, to get her affairs in order. Can you imagine getting that kind of news? You're in the prime of your life. Your kids still need you. Your husband needs you. Your church community needs you. And some doctor is telling you to plan your funeral. Most people would crumble. Most people would start making peace with the inevitable, but Dodie Osteen wasn't most people. What she did next is where this story gets really interesting, because it challenges everything we think we know about faith, healing, and what it means to truly believe in divine intervention. Instead of accepting the doctor's verdict, Dodie and her husband John did something that might sound crazy to some people, but makes perfect sense if you understand the depth of their faith. They literally got down on their faces at the foot of their bed and started praying for a miracle. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You've heard stories like this before, desperate people clinging to false hope, refusing to accept reality. But here's where Dodie's story becomes undeniable. She didn't just pray once and hope for the best. She made healing her full-time job. She started speaking scripture over her body every single day. She put Bible verses about healing all over her house. She carried pictures of herself when she was healthy and looked at them constantly, declaring that this was how God saw her for 3 weeks. She did this religiously. And I'm not talking about casual, wishful thinking prayers. I'm talking about the kind of fervent, desperate, all-consuming prayer that comes from someone who truly believes that God can override medical science. She would walk around her house collecting the mail, doing normal daily activities, but constantly speaking life over her situation. The transformation that happened after those 3 weeks is something that even her own son, Paul, who's a trained surgeon, admits he can't explain medically. Paul has gone on record saying he saw the scans, he saw the biopsy results, he knows it wasn't a misdiagnosis. According to him, his mother had multiple lesions on her liver that had metastasized from another location. In medical terms, that's game over. But 3 weeks after that desperate prayer session with her husband, Dodie Osteen walked to the front of Lakewood Church and started praying for other sick people. Think about the audacity of that moment. Here's a woman who was supposed to be dead or dying, standing in front of her congregation, declaring that God had healed her, and then having the courage to pray for other people's healing. That's not just faith. That's the kind of faith that either makes you look like a complete fool or establishes you as someone who has tapped into something supernatural. And here's what I find most fascinating about Dodie's story. She didn't just claim to be healed and then quietly go about her business. She made healing ministry the centerpiece of the rest of her life. For over 4 decades after her supposed death sentence, she held monthly healing services at Lakewood Church. People would fly in from all over the world just to have Mama Dodie pray for them. She wrote a book about her experience called Healed of Cancer that became a cornerstone resource for people facing similar battles. But what really sets her apart is how she handled the responsibility that came with her testimony. She could have easily become one of those prosperity gospel figures who promise health and wealth to anyone who just believes hard enough and sends in a donation. Instead, she seemed to understand that her healing came with a burden to serve others who were walking through their own valleys of the shadow of death. The ripple effects of her experience shaped everything about Lakewood Church's ministry philosophy. When Joel Osteen took over leadership from his father in 1999, healing and faith remained central themes, but they were always grounded in the authentic testimony of what his mother had experienced. It's one thing to preach about miraculous healing from a theological standpoint. It's another thing entirely when your own mother is living proof that sometimes inexplicably the impossible happens. What strikes me most about Dodie's approach to her healing testimony is how she never seemed to use it for personal gain or to elevate herself above others who didn't receive the same miracle. She understood that her story wasn't about her being more faithful or more deserving than anyone else. It was about being a steward of something supernatural that had happened to her and using that stewardship to bring hope to others who were facing impossible situations. Now, let's be honest about something that people don't always want to discuss when talking about the Osteen family. They've never been without their critics. And Dodie's healing testimony, while inspiring to millions, has been at the center of some pretty heated theological debates for decades. The reality is that when you claim God miraculously healed you of terminal cancer, and then you spend the next 40 years building a ministry around that claim, you're going to have people questioning everything. Medical professionals, theologians, skeptics, and even fellow Christians have raised eyebrows at the Osteen family's approach to faith healing and what critics call the prosperity gospel. Some medical experts have suggested that misdiagnosis or spontaneous remission could explain what happened to Dodie, though her own son Paul's medical testimony makes those explanations more difficult to accept. But the bigger controversy has always been about what the family did with that testimony. Critics argue that the Osteens have used Dodie's healing story to promote a version of Christianity that promises health and wealth to anyone with enough faith, which they say is both theologically dangerous and emotionally manipulative. The criticism intensified when Joel took over leadership of Lakewood, and the church's message became more explicitly focused on personal prosperity and success. Theological critics argue that this turns Christianity into a cosmic vending machine where you put in faith and prayers and get out health, wealth, and happiness. They point out that this message can be devastating for people who pray fervently for healing and don't receive it, leaving them wondering if they just didn't have enough faith. But here's what I find interesting about Dodie specifically. Throughout all the controversy surrounding her family's ministry, she seemed to maintain a different approach to her healing testimony. Unlike some faith healers who make grandiose promises or claim special anointing, Dodie always seemed to present her story simply as something that happened to her, not as a formula that would work for everyone. She never claimed to have special powers or a unique connection to God that others couldn't access. She just testified about what she experienced and then spent her life praying for others who were facing similar battles. There's something remarkably humble about that approach that sets her apart from more flamboyant prosperity gospel figures. The other thing that strikes me about Dodie's legacy is how she handled the responsibility that came with her testimony. She could have easily capitalized on her story in ways that would have made her incredibly wealthy. Instead, she seemed to view her healing as something that obligated her to serve others, not something that entitled her to special treatment or financial gain. That doesn't mean the controversy just goes away. The Osteen family's approach to Christianity continues to divide believers, and Dodie's healing story will always be part of that debate. Some people see it as proof that God still performs miracles today and that faith can literally move mountains. Others see it as an example of how anecdotal experiences can be used to promote questionable theology. What I think is most important is that we can acknowledge both the inspiration and the complications of Dodie's story without dismissing either side. Her testimony has genuinely brought hope to countless people facing their own medical crises. At the same time, the way that testimony has been integrated into Lakewood's broader ministry approach has raised legitimate questions about prosperity gospel theology. As we remember Dodie Osteen's life and legacy, I think the most honest thing we can do is recognize that her story is complicated. She was a woman who claimed to experience something miraculous and then dedicated the rest of her life to serving others based on that experience. Whether you believe her testimony was literally supernatural or not, there's something admirable about the way she used whatever platform she had to pray for people and offer them hope. Her death marks the end of an era for Lakewood Church and for a certain type of American Christianity that emerged in the latter half of the 20th century. Love it or hate it, the ministry that she and her husband built from a handful of Baptist church members to a global phenomenon has shaped how millions of people think about faith, healing, and the role of Christianity in addressing suffering. The question now is, what happens to that legacy as it moves forward without its founding matriarch? Will Joel and the next generation of Osteens continue to emphasize the healing ministry that was so central to Dodie's life? Will they address the theological criticisms that have followed their family for decades? Or will they chart a different course entirely? Those are questions that only time will answer. What we can say for certain is that Mama Dodie Osteen lived a life that refused to accept limitation as the final word. And that philosophy, whether you agree with its theological implications or not, touched millions of lives around the world. If this video has gotten you thinking about faith, healing, and the complicated questions that arise when we claim God intervenes in our circumstances, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you or someone you know experienced something you couldn't explain medically? How do you balance faith and skepticism when it comes to miraculous healing claims? And what do you think about the responsibility that comes with sharing testimonies like Dodie's? Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell if you want more content exploring the intersection of faith, culture, and the complicated stories that shape American Christianity. These conversations matter, and I appreciate you taking the time to engage with them thoughtfully and respectfully.